Hello, figure drawing enthusiasts and passerbys. I'm finally doing the follow-up to my 100 Figures with Cause challenge. Before I get into that, for new people, Reference Wednesdays is a video series started by a good friend, Ahmed Aldoori, who's also on YouTube. Please check out his channel. In which I do some figure studies using photo reference packs made by Studio Graphite. You can find a 20% off code in my description along with links. Also, this will most likely be the last pre-recorded episode for the foreseeable future. I'm planning to do a weekly figure drawing live stream going forward, and so we'll see how that goes. I don't know if I'll start next week, but hopefully. And so, on to the video. I do apologize that it took so long to make this follow-up video for the 100 figure challenge. I got super caught up in other projects that I had to finish with external deadlines and such, and I also noticed that participation in this challenge was pretty low, and I'm not sure why exactly, but I have to assume that maybe one of the reasons is that 100 was just too much. Also, maybe it's just too boring. I don't know. It's tough for me to say what constitutes a big challenge per se in relation to figure drawing, mostly because while I was studying animation in college, we were sort of expected to do life drawing pretty much every day, and the length of each session was 3 hours. So needless to say, this resulted in heaps and heaps of drawing pads filled with hundreds of figures every week. So I assumed this was okay, but you know, looking back, that's probably just too much for normal people. Sorry guys. But yeah, I don't foresee myself trying to start any more challenges anytime soon though. But I will keep a more realistic scope in mind if there ever will be a next time. So yeah. Okay. My initial plan was to do some draw overs and critique the stuff some of you uploaded on social media using the hashtag, but I decided against that for a few reasons. I think I was able to notice a lot of common things, like recurring things, from looking at submitted artwork, especially from watching some of the videos. And first of all, I want to thank those of you who participated. As some of you mentioned, this challenge I started was a final push for you to do a bunch of figure drawings and that you've been putting off. And I'm so happy to hear that you were finally able to do it, and I'm really glad that I was able to help with the motivation. I know that sometimes motivation is really difficult to come by or summon when you need it, so always glad to give some of that to other people. And I can definitely see a lot of progress and improvements in the videos I watched and drawings that were posted on Instagram. You guys are great and should definitely be proud of having completed this challenge. Or even if you didn't complete it, if you got any number of figure drawings done, it's still an accomplishment, because figure drawing can be super boring, and I don't know, honestly, when you manage to stick to it for any number of hours or days, it is always a good thing. So yeah. So secondly, after mulling it over, I decided that the best approach to this follow-up video would be to compile a list of tips. Similar to a lot of my other Reference Wednesdays videos, I think a lot more people could benefit from a compilation of things rather than a specific critique meant for a specific person. And plus, it suddenly felt weird to put up a public critique of someone else's stuff just because it feels more like a private thing, if you know what I mean. So yeah. I decided to make this video about common pitfalls, things to avoid while doing gesture or figure drawings. Just a quick disclaimer, these tips are based purely on my own experience and mistakes that I have made and learned from in the past, and things I genuinely believe would help people get stronger results. It's totally fine if you disagree or if you think there are better methodologies out there. I think there are a ton of different approaches, and you're totally welcome to use any one of them. And I don't claim to be an authority on these things, so just take it or leave it. Okay, and the last thing before I get into the tips, the reference pack I'm using in this video is called Steel Lady. I absolutely love this photo pack. It's fantastic, as usual, and it's by Studio Graphite. Like I mentioned, I don't know where they find these incredible models, but it's such a fantastic resource, like, honestly. Anyways, check out their other packs as well, and there's all sorts of models and scenarios, as well as plenty of environmental packs as well to study backgrounds and or matte painting and whatnot. So 20% off code and link in my description. Alrighty. So here are my 5 tips on things to avoid. Starting with the head. That's my tip. Avoid starting with the head. So I've noticed that it seems to be a really common thing for people to start the figure drawing from the head. I don't necessarily think that it's the wrong move, but although it is a logical choice, I am personally of the opinion that it's not the best choice most of the time. And here is why. Firstly, I think it can make it more difficult to get the proportions down correctly if you start with the head. And secondly, since the head is the furthest from the feet, there is a high chance of just getting kind of bogged down by the head and then the torso and just losing energy by the time you get to the feet placement, which is a very crucial thing to get a good sense of weight and balance in the pose, which is something I'm actually going to talk about later on as one of the other tips. But yeah, and lastly, if the eventual purpose is to use your figure drawing skills to aid in your illustration or comics, I personally think it's a lot easier to place the figure where you want it to go when you start with the torso, because it is the largest shape and thus occupying the most space. So it's kind of easier to eyeball like where you want to put the character if you start drawing it with the torso rather than the head, because the head is relatively small compared to the rest of the body, and it can often lead to misplaced figures that you will have to move around and such. And the position of the torso generally establishes where all the other limbs will go because they attach to the torso, as well as the head. So yeah, I highly suggest at least trying to start with a torso to see if you get better results. It's definitely worth a shot. When I do character designs for myself or for work, I start with the torso like 80 or 90% of the time, and these are drawings that are done without a reference, just jotting down sketches for a new character, jotting down quick poses and such. And I think at the very least it's good to explore your options and try a different approach just to see if it would yield better results for you or help you up the speed of your figures or character art. I personally find it to be one of the quickest approaches. It's very straightforward, and I've gotten very comfortable with it, whereas I spent many years starting with the head, and as a result I had to redraw many things many times, and especially on paper it can be quite a pain because the free transform tool isn't as freely available, so you have to use an eraser and just draw things over and over again. But yeah, so moving on to tip number 2, and that is the missing line of action. So this ties into the first tip a little bit, because even though I recommend starting the figure with the torso, it's also good to consider starting with just 1 or 2 lines that will dictate the energy of the pose. This depends on the pose, of course, as some poses are more static and the line of action isn't necessarily super visible in those or even needed to start, but I'm just going to provide some examples here on how to determine and start with a line of action to capture some energy in more dynamic poses before you actually start on blocking in the body parts or the torso, as I suggest. Because after all, dynamic poses are the most fun, and capturing a sense of movement and liveliness starts with the determining and retaining a clear, unobscured line of action. So the line of action is a curve that captures the force and direction of a dynamic pose. Typically, it can align with the figure's spine, as is often recommended by life drawing instructors, but not always. I find that what you're looking for is basically the most prominent and visible imaginary curve along which the figure is roughly situated. So I often like to find 2 lines of action that intersect. When the goal is to capture the movement and energy, it's often a good approach to avoid getting too bogged down with accuracy and instead making slight exaggerations in order to strengthen the clarity of the lines of action. One of the fundamental principles of good design is rhythm, and getting down a main and secondary line of action first will help establish some rhythm of the pose right off the bat. I think this may be a bit of a difficult thing to understand theoretically in concept, but think of rhythm as something like the guide that leads the eye around the pose or the shapes. It's often a combination of straight and curved lines that bounce around the figure, and it is a huge part of shape design, probably the biggest part of shape design in my opinion. I mean, obviously there's like a bunch of other design principles, and I would highly suggest looking into those if you are so inclined. And speaking of shapes, let's move on to the next step, which is tip number 3, the shape of the head. So this is something worth discussing. I think I noticed that the most common shape people tend to utilize for the head is an oval, and I do this too all the time. However, I'm going to make an argument in favor of avoiding the oval head shape depending on your skill level and familiarity with anatomy and structure. So firstly, you might think, well, if you use an oval to draw the head, then why would you argue against it? And I do have several reasons for that. So this is actually kind of something that ties into my next tip, which is about using the undersketch, correctly. And that's the first reason. I use an oval only as the crude rudimentary undersketch because my second pass, or the clarification / cleanup step of a pose or a character drawing, is to build the head and facial structure on top of that oval. The oval is basically just there for placement and rough size of the head and nothing else. It doesn't really contain that much structural information. So what I've noticed from looking at a lot of beginner drawing figure drawings is the use of an oval as the basic shape that carries over to all the way to the finish, lacking any further clarification or structure. And this makes the drawing structurally weak and incomplete as a result, in my opinion. So if you consider yourself a beginner and feel like you need a lot of improvement when it comes to drawing heads and faces, I would highly suggest avoiding the oval as your basic head shape, and instead you should utilize a more structured approach from the get-go, which is to draw the cranium shape first, which is like a squashed circle or sphere, I guess, if you're speaking in 3D terms, followed by the basic shape of the face, or the grouped and simplified facial bones that hang off the cranium, essentially. This is a much more solid structure, and it's crucial to get used to drawing this from different angles. Only once you can comfortably do so, you can afford to start with a simpler oval or rectangular box as an undersketch, which you will easily be able to elaborate upon in the clarification stage of the gesture drawing. And the undersketch versus clarification stage actually leads me to the next step, which is, the next tip. Tip number 4, using the undersketch correctly. AKA, avoid tracing the undersketch. Something I've noticed is being done a lot is the straight up tracing of the undersketch. If you're going to divide your process into an undersketch and then a cleanup for clarification, I think it's very important to understand why you're doing that in the first place and make your adjust your approach accordingly. So if you're just going to trace right over the undersketch like 1-to-1 without making any changes to it, you might as well just skip the undersketch part completely and just go straight to the final cleaner drawing, or just do a sketch without going over it twice. Especially if you're using a different color for the undersketch, you should treat it as a rough base, which should be improved upon when you take a darker color and go over it once more. Some things to consider: improve and push the shape designs of the limbs, clarify the structure of the face and facial features and or skull, and don't be afraid to make the line like in a slightly different place, to move it over, make some shapes more exaggerated, make the thighs thicker, make the waist slimmer, or the other way around. It should be more experimental, and I think that it's a little bit redundant to just trace the undersketch completely, and I think it kind of robs you of an opportunity to learn how to push your shapes more. So yeah, add more nuance to the outlines of visible muscles if there are any, or practice line weight. That's also a very good one. Just practicing line weight is already much better than simply tracing over the undersketch with even lines. So just to quickly reiterate, if you're gonna go and do an undersketch, first make sure you utilize to your advantage and do not waste time by simply using even lines to trace it. So yes, something I would highly suggest is to practice using the same tool for both undersketch and cleanup with a big focus on line economy. I'm sure you've heard me mention this before in my previous videos, because I have spoken about line economy, and I think it's like one of the most important things when it comes to gestures and figure drawing and just drawing in general. It just makes it easier. But yeah, so using one tool for different purposes or steps can actually teach you a ton of useful things. It's kind of like tool mastery. So if you're using a pen or a pencil, for instance, you can practice making very light and minimal strokes for the undersketch, and then use more decisive darker marks for the cleanup, and explore the range of what one tool can give you. And I personally believe that it's a more focused approach, which will often yield greater results. And I think tool mastery is actually a very big part of drawing, because it should definitely involve some experimentation. And it's actually one of the things that also makes the process a lot of fun, at least for me anyways. So yeah, I'll just repeat one more time. Your cleanup should never look identical to your undersketch. And so, moving on. Tip number 5, weight and balance, which is the last tip. So, I've noticed that weight and balance are things that could be much stronger in a lot of beginner figure drawings. They're pretty common weak points, so I figured it would be nice to talk about. So I have a few suggestions on capturing weight and balance. Firstly, you have to always plant the feet, and these feet have to be planted very firmly. I'm sure I've also spoken about this before, probably haven't mentioned it enough, but it is a crucial part of completing a pose or just drawing characters in general, outside or even outside of figure sketching is my point. So especially if you find the shapes of feet kind of complicated and difficult to decipher, I would suggest just plant a straight line that is in direct contact with the ground, because that is more or less what is happening anyways. And always be aware of the ground plane. So I'm just gonna talk about that for a second. If you have a hard time figuring out how to ground the figure on the floor, you can try putting a few perspective grids on the floor plane. You'd be shocked at how it instantly brings dimension and clarity to the scene instead of just having a weightless figure float on the page. It helps a lot to draw a line from one foot to the other if they're both on the ground. So yes, something I wanted to mention is that all experienced, intermediate, or advanced level artists see things on the page that they take into account while they draw, but they don't actually need to draw these things. So let me explain. It's something that happens innately and therefore is seldom even mentioned, I think. But the first thing you should do, if you don't do this already, is to perceive the flat surface of the paper or screen as three-dimensional, like as if it's an empty white room with depth to be filled and not just a flat surface. If you do this all the time, you don't even need to put down grid lines for perspective. You can just imagine it. Like if you never think of it as a flat plane, you just imagine it being a 3D space. It will help you a lot. I guarantee you that this is something all skilled artists do, and some of them probably don't even consciously realize it, because I do think it happens innately, and it's something that maybe if it's explained to you, you will understand that it is something you in fact do. But for those of you that feel like you don't, I would suggest like trying it. If you have a hard time with this particular aspect, you should definitely utilize grids or surface lines here and there. I think it will help you perceive what you're drawing as three-dimensional, and that is, it's like the most important part about this type of drawing, figure drawing, whatever. Definitely don't go too crazy though with this, and avoid mindlessly putting grids on everything. Definitely seen people do that before. I would not suggest going that far, but sometimes it can do a lot just to show depth in your art. So This may sound like a tangent, but I do think it's the first step to being able to show weight and balance. After all, the figure has to be interacting with something in order to show these things, and most often it is just the ground plane. So planting feet on the ground plane will show weight, or will indicate weight. Balance is a bit trickier. It's a lot more difficult to explain, and it is a pretty detailed topic that requires specific visual examples. And so you should definitely watch Proko's video on that. It explains things perfectly, in my opinion. And Proko's video is titled How to Draw Balanced Poses. You can just find it right here on YouTube. And that is all. So these are the 5 tips that I gathered from looking through all the challenge submissions, and I'm sure they will be beneficial to any beginner plus figure drawing enthusiasts out there. So this is the part where I have to say that although I do enjoy making these types of tip videos, this one will most likely be the last one for the foreseeable future, like I mentioned at the beginning. I've been wanting to put together new Skillshare classes for ages on these topics, and realized that the amount of time and effort I end up putting into these Reference Wednesdays videos could actually easily be put towards something more substantial like a Skillshare class, but be more dedicated and have better structure. So I think I have to consider that as at least something I should put some focus on in the near future, hopefully. But for now, I do have my plate full with a lot of other projects, so I'm just gonna indefinitely suspend the pre-recorded tip/instructional types of figure drawing videos like I've been doing sometimes. And since I still want to keep Reference Wednesdays afloat, I am planning to schedule weekly live streams in which I'll just either do studies or figure drawings or warm-ups, and I was even thinking of studying other artists. I want to show you guys how I go about doing master studies and deciphering other artists' styles and picking up things that I want to retain from somebody else's stuff. So like I've done before with Frank Frazetta in one of my previous Reference Wednesdays episodes. I hope you guys liked this video, and thank you again for participating in the challenge. I want to congratulate everyone who actually managed to finish it, and like I said, even if you didn't, it's still progress regardless, and some figure drawing is better than none. So yeah, if you still want to do it, just do it. It's never too late. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!